Section 4, Qualitative Research. The learning objectives for this section are 1. List several ways in which qualitative research differs from quantitative research in psychology. 2. Describe the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research in psychology compared with quantitative research. And 3. Give examples of qualitative research in psychology. What is qualitative research? This textbook is primarily about quantitative research, in part because most studies conducted in psychology are quantitative in nature. Quantitative researchers typically start with a focused research question or hypothesis, collect a small amount of numerical data from a large number of individuals, describe the resulting data using statistical techniques, and draw general conclusions about some large population. Although this method is by far the most common approach to conducting empirical research in psychology, there's an important alternative called qualitative research. Qualitative research originated in the disciplines of anthropology and sociology, but is now used to study psychological topics as well. Qualitative researchers generally begin with a less focused research question, collect large amounts of relatively unfiltered data from a relatively small number of individuals, and describe their data using non-statistical techniques such as grounded theory, thematic analysis, critical discourse analysis, or interpretative phenomenological analysis. It's a mouthful. They're usually less concerned with drawing general conclusions about human behavior than with understanding in detail the experience of their research participants. Consider, for example, a study by researcher Per Lundquist and his colleagues who wanted to learn how the families of teenage suicide victims cope with their loss. They didn't have a specific research question or hypothesis, such as what percentage of family members join suicide support groups. Instead, they wanted to understand the variety of reactions that families had, with a focus on what it was like from their perspectives. To address this question, they interviewed the families of 10 teenage suicide victims in their homes in rural Sweden. The interviews were relatively unstructured, beginning with a general request for the families to talk about the victim and ending with an invitation to talk about anything else that they wanted to tell the interviewer. One of the most important themes that emerged from these interviews was that even as life returned to normal, the families continued to struggle with the questions of why their loved ones committed suicide. This struggle appeared to be especially difficult for families in which the suicide was most unexpected. The purpose of qualitative research. Again, this textbook is primarily about quantitative research in psychology. The strength of quantitative research is its ability to provide precise answers to specific research questions and to draw general conclusions about human behavior. This method is how we know that people have a strong tendency to obey authority figures, for example, and that female undergraduate students are not substantially more talkative than male undergraduate students. But while quantitative research is good at providing precise answers to specific research questions, it's not nearly as good at generating novel and interesting research questions. Likewise, while quantitative research is good at drawing general conclusions about human behavior, it's not nearly as good at providing detailed descriptions of the behavior of particular groups in particular situations. And quantitative research is not very good at communicating what it's actually like to be a member of a particular group in a particular situation. But the relative weaknesses of quantitative research are the relative strengths of qualitative research. Qualitative research can help researchers to generate new and interesting research questions and hypotheses. The research of Lundquist and colleagues, for example, suggests that there may be a general relationship between how unexpected a suicide is and how consumed the family is with trying to understand why the teen committed suicide. This relationship can now be explored using quantitative research. But it's unclear whether this question would have arisen at all without the researchers sitting down with the families and listening to what they themselves wanted to say about their experience. Qualitative research can also provide rich and detailed descriptions of human behavior in the real-world contexts in which it occurs. Among qualitative researchers, this depth is often referred to as thick description. Similarly, qualitative research can convey a sense of what it's actually like to be a member of a particular group or in a particular situation, what qualitative researchers often refer to as the lived experience of the research participants. Lundquist and colleagues, for example, describe how all the families spontaneously offered to show the interviewer the victim's bedroom or the place where the suicide occurred, revealing the importance of those physical locations to the families. It seems unlikely that a quantitative study would have discovered that detail. Data collection and analysis in qualitative research. Data collection approaches in qualitative research are quite varied and involve naturalistic observation, participant observation, archival data, artwork, and many other things. But one of the most common approaches, especially for psychological research, is to conduct interviews. Interviews in qualitative research can be unstructured, consisting of a small number of general questions or prompts that allow participants to talk about what is of interest to them. Or they can be structured, where there's a strict script that the interviewer does not deviate from. Most interviews are in between the two and are called semi-structured interviews, where the researcher has a few consistent questions and can follow up by asking more detailed questions about the topics that come up. Such interviews can be lengthy and detailed, but they're usually conducted with a relatively small sample. The unstructured interview was the approach used by Lundquist and colleagues in their research on the families of suicide victims, because the researchers were aware that how much was disclosed about such a sensitive topic should be led by the families, not by the researchers. Another approach used in qualitative research involves small groups of people who participate together in interviews focused on a particular topic or issue, and these are known as focus groups. The interaction among participants in a focus group can sometimes bring out more information than can be learned in a one on one setting. The use of focus groups has become a standard technique in business and industry among those who want to understand consumer tastes and preferences. The content of all focus group interviews is usually recorded and transcribed to facilitate later analyses. However, we know from social psychology that group dynamics are often at play in any group, including focus groups, and it's useful to be aware of those possibilities. For example, the desire to be liked by others can lead participants to provide inaccurate answers that they believe will be perceived favorably by the other participants. The same way, the same may be said for personality characteristics. For example, highly extroverted participants can sometimes dominate the discussions within focus groups. Data analysis and qualitative research. Although quantitative and qualitative research generally differ along several important dimensions, such as the specificity of the research question or the type of data collected, it's the method of data analysis that distinguishes them more clearly than anything else. To illustrate this idea, imagine a team of researchers that conducts a series of unstructured interviews with people recovering from alcohol use disorder to learn about the role of their religious faith in their recovery. Although this project sounds like qualitative research, imagine further that once they collect the data, they code the data in terms of how often each participant mentions God or a higher power, and they then use descriptive and inferential statistics to find out whether those who mention God more often are more successful in abstaining from alcohol. Now it sounds like quantitative research. In other words, the quantitative qualitative distinction depends more on what researchers do with the data that they've collected than with why or how they collected the data. But what does qualitative data analysis look like? Just as there are many ways to collect data in qualitative research, there are many ways to analyze data. Here we focus on one general approach called grounded theory. This approach was developed within the field of sociology in the 1960s and has gradually gained popularity in psychology. Remember that in quantitative research, it's typical for the researcher to start with a theory, derive a hypothesis from that theory, and then collect data to test that specific hypothesis. In qualitative research using grounded theory, researchers start with the data and develop a theory or an interpretation that is grounded in those data. They do this analysis in stages. First, they identify ideas that are repeated throughout the data. Then, they organize these ideas into a smaller number of broader themes. Finally, they write a theoretical narrative, which is an interpretation of the data in terms of the themes that they've identified. This theoretical narrative focuses on the subjective experience of the participants and is usually supported by many direct quotations from the participants themselves. As an example, consider a study by researchers Laura Abrams and Laura Curran, who used the grounded theory approach to study the experience of postpartum depression symptoms among low-income mothers. Their data were the result of unstructured interviews with 19 participants. Table 6.4 shows the 5 broad themes that the researchers identified, and the more specific repeating ideas that made up each of those themes. In their research report, they provide numerous quotations from their participants, such as this one from Destiny. Well, just recently my apartment was broken into, and the fact that his Medicaid for some reason was canceled, so a lot of things was happening within the last 2 weeks all at one time. So that in itself, I don't want to say almost drove me mad, but it put me in a funk. Like, I really was depressed. Their theoretical narrative focused on the participants' experience of their symptoms, not as an abstract affective disorder, but as closely tied to the daily struggle of raising children alone under often difficult circumstances. The quantitative qualitative debate. Given their differences, it may come as no surprise that quantitative and qualitative research in psychology and related fields don't coexist in complete harmony. Some quantitative researchers criticize qualitative methods on the grounds that they lack objectivity, that they're difficult to evaluate in terms of reliability and validity, and don't allow for generalization to people or situations other than those actually studied. At the same time, some qualitative researchers criticize quantitative methods on the grounds that they overlook the richness of human behavior and experience and instead answer simple questions about easily quantifiable variables. In general, however, qualitative researchers are well aware of the issues of objectivity, reliability, validity, and generalizability. In fact, they've developed a number of frameworks for addressing these issues. These frameworks are beyond the scope of our discussion, though. In general, quantitative researchers are well aware of the issue of oversimplification as well. They don't believe that all human behavior and experience can be adequately described in terms of a small number of variables and the statistical relationships among them. Instead, quantitative researchers use simplification as a strategy for uncovering general principles of human behavior. Many researchers from both the quantitative and qualitative camps now agree that the two approaches can and should be combined into what has come to be called mixed methods research. One approach to combining quantitative and qualitative research is to use qualitative research for hypothesis generation and quantitative research for hypothesis testing. Again, while a qualitative study might suggest that families who experience an unexpected suicide have more difficulty resolving the question of why, a well-designed quantitative study could test a hypothesis by measuring these specific variables in a larger sample. A second approach to combining quantitative and qualitative research is referred to as triangulation. The idea is to use both quantitative and qualitative methods simultaneously to study the same general questions and to compare the results. If the results of the quantitative and qualitative methods converge on the same general conclusion, they reinforce and enrich each other. If the results diverge, then they suggest an interesting new question. Why do the results diverge, and how can they be reconciled? Using qualitative research can often help clarify quantitative results via triangulation. Trenor et al. Investigated the experience of female engineering students at a university. In the first phase, female engineering students were asked to complete a survey where they rated a number of their perceptions, including their sense of belonging. Their results were compared across the student ethnicities, and statistically, the various ethnic groups showed no differences in their ratings of their sense of belonging. One might look at that result and conclude that ethnicity doesn't have anything to do with one's sense of belonging. However, in the second phase, the authors also conducted interviews with the students. And in those interviews, many minority students reported how the diversity of cultures at the university enhanced their sense of belonging. Without the qualitative component, we might have drawn the wrong conclusion about the quantitative results. This example shows how qualitative and quantitative research work together to help us understand human behavior. Some researchers have characterized qualitative research as best for identifying behaviors or the phenomenon, whereas quantitative research is best for understanding meaning or identifying the mechanism. However, Bryman argues for breaking down the divide between these arbitrarily different ways of investigating the same questions.